Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the second flipped classroom lecture for Mr. Miller's AP Literature class. You guys are going to take notes on the following lecture, and then those notes are going to be turned into our tools in the upcoming day, so we'll do that on Wednesday. This lecture is going to cover a couple of things. It's going to talk about The Sun Also Rises, things to look for in it, but more specifically, it's actually going to talk about background and provide a little bit of context for where the story is taking place and who the characters are. So we'll have quite a bit of information. As always, there will be spoken information and information that's on the screen, and it's important that your notes include both of those things so that you have all the information necessary. So let's talk a little bit about Hemingway's Paris, and this is a combination of both the real and the fiction that is Hemingway's Paris. So Hemingway's Paris, this is taking place in the 1920s, and it was a time of large change in the world. World War I had ended just a couple years ago, and we already talked about how World War I is a power dynamic shift where women suddenly gain a lot of previously denied opportunities because when all the men went off to war, the women took over positions of authority in business and in industry, and when the men came back, the women didn't want to give that power back up, and to a large extent they kept that power and exhibited it in a number of ways. And one of those ways is in the movement that was commonly referred to as flappers. Flappers were young women, and they were women who started to disregard the social norms. And so they began to act in ways that would have been considered inappropriate just a decade ago. They displayed themselves in a very sexual nature. They had very short clothing, very short hair. They danced in a fashion that was considered inappropriate. And they really kind of became what we now think of as very kind of typical female openness and confidence in using their sexuality and in being proud of their sexuality. But these things didn't happen before the 1920s. And so it was best embodied in these young girls, which were called flappers because of the style of their dress would flap back and forth as they danced. Hemingway's Paris in the 1920s was also full of something broadly called expatriates. And an expatriate is actually two different words. Ex means out, and then patria is actually from pater, which means it's the Latin for fatherland, and so it's out of your land. So an expatriate is anybody that's out of the land that they were born in. Paris was a destination for expatriates, and it was lots of expatriates from the USA left the USA, having some trouble with my stylus here, left the USA and moved to Paris to live in Paris and be with other artists. And Hemingway is one of those groups, or one of those people of those groups, and it ends up being, it's a large group full of artists and authors, and really just kind of the famous people of the day. Movie stars weren't really a thing yet, but so it's what we would now think of as like the famous people, the important people. And the reason they came to Paris is because Paris is this cultural epicenter. Epicenter means like the center of something, so where things originate from. Paris was this epicenter. It had become, during the war, and really just for the last decade or couple of decades, had become the center of food and art and fashion, and all of this stuff comes from Paris and originates in Paris and really drives the rest of the world in kind of the way that we think of America now. Before America, it was probably Paris where people looked to see what people were wearing and what they were eating and what they were hanging on their walls. All of this would have taken place. All of this would have been informed by what people in Paris were doing. So all of this up here, this is all actual. This is the real Paris. And this down here, the cliquish moving in groups, is the real Paris as well, but it's what we see in our novel is Jake and Brett and Robert and Mike, to some instance. They move together, but they also all have their own groups of friends. And generally speaking, anytime you're going to have something you're going to call a clique is going to be lots of drama. And adults are no different. Artists tend to be very dramatic people with lots of alcohol-fueled drama. And they moved in groups, they had friends, they lost friends, they talked about each other behind their backs. There was lots and lots of drama. So that's Hemingway's Paris. Informed by a lot of real things, Paris was this center for change, this center for fashion. Women were embracing their sexuality and kind of displaying their sexuality in a way they never had before. It was full of people from other countries, especially America, called expatriates, who came there to experience this and then brought their own personalities and influences into it as well. Now, Hemingway's Spain. Our characters leave Paris and journey to Spain. One of the things that's important to remember, though, is that in Europe, traveling between countries is like traveling between states. And so, yes, they go to Spain, and it is a very different place, but it was not difficult to get there. I mean, in the novel, they take a bus and a train to get there. So it's the equivalent of going from Chicago to St. Louis, but the culture changes completely. And that's really the biggest thing, is the culture of each of these different places is totally different. And in Spain, we see it's very different from France. And in Spain, we see the country, right? So we're going to have the country versus the city in terms of Paris and Spain. The country life is going to be rural, and it's going to be more simple, we'll say. There's still constant drinking, though, all the time. They're continuing to drink. However, the drink changes, and when they're in Spain, they really are just drinking huge amounts of wine. None of the fancy cocktails or the mixed drinks or any of that. And in Spain, it's lots of wine. Wine is very cheap in Spain in this time and place. And so it's very, very easy for them to find wine and get very drunk off it. Paris and Spain are also very different. So we have the country and the city. We have the simplicity of drinking wine versus other drinks. And generally, when we're in Spain, we see our characters having less control and being more destructive. And part of that is because this idea of everybody drinking, right? I don't know if I mentioned this, but there's lots of drinking that happens in Spain, if you haven't figured that out yet. Lots of drinking that happens in Spain. But it's really in Spain when we see our characters kind of start to lose control. And we see the effects of all their drinking, the effects of the cliques and of the drama. And this is really where it all happens, is out in the country where they're supposedly away from the city and all of the problems with the city, but it's really in the country where we see our characters kind of fall apart. Speaking of our characters falling apart, so our characters are all very, very flawed in this novel. They have lots of imperfections. And Hemingway was fond of saying, and I'm not going to try and write this out because my handwriting is not good with this stylus, but that a person can be destroyed but not defeated. That you can completely ruin a person but not change their basic nature. And that's one of the things that he looks at in his characters. They're all flawed in some way, but their flaws, they weren't necessarily born with them, but their flaws were created when they were destroyed. And the thing that destroyed all of our characters is World War I. That is the big, unspoken of thing that caused all of our characters to suffer and to exhibit their flaws in various ways. We know that Jake was wounded. It made him impotent, meaning he's not able to have sex, and that this is his defining flaw. This is the thing that he cannot get over. We know that Brett in the war, we learn very, very quickly, very, very briefly, but she lost her fiance. This was probably her first true love, and it seems like the loss of this true love is what really has driven her to become this kind of sleep with anyone, look for love anywhere kind of person. Robert's flaw is perhaps the most interesting in that we don't find out if he ever served in the war. And so we can assume that Robert didn't serve, and he did not fight in the war. And to him, this creates this kind of guilt complex where everyone else went to the war and fought and lost people and had friends die, and Robert didn't. And so in a way, this kind of emasculates him as well. Emasculates means to make someone less of a man, to take away the thing that makes them a man. Jake has been literally emasculated. He's been rendered impotent. And Robert has been kind of figuratively emasculated in that he didn't fight in the war, and so therefore he feels like less of a man around people. One of the things that Hemingway is looking at in creating these characters who are all flawed by the war is this idea that from war not all scars are visible. All of these characters are wounded in a way, hurt in a way from the war that is not necessarily seen on the surface, but very, very clearly affects who they are as individuals. Now, this is as good a time as any to talk just a little bit about Hemingway, just so you kind of understand where he's coming from. So Hemingway was born in 1899, and he was born in Oak Park, Illinois, just about 30 miles west of here, right out on the Green Line. You can get to Oak Park. 1899, so he grew up in this time period. In fact, he served in World War I, and even more interesting, he was in Italy during World War I, and even more interesting is he was wounded in that war. Now, it differs a little bit. He was an ambulance driver, and he had shrapnel wounds in the legs instead of a wound to his genital region, but definitely some similarities between Hemingway's time in World War I and Jake Barnes' time in World War I. Much like Jake Barnes, Hemingway was also an expatriate. He lived in Paris. He lived in the U.S. for a little bit in Kansas City and then moved out to Paris. And at that time was a beginning writer. He was writing. He had not yet published The Sun Also Rises. In fact, he hadn't published anything yet, but he was becoming a writer. He had originally been a reporter, and that was kind of transitioning. The expatriate scene in Paris is unlike anything that has ever happened before, and it was orchestrated and kind of created around this woman named Gertrude Stein, who was an art collector and a poet, and her apartment became the meeting place for all of the literary greats, for people like F. Scott Fitzgerald, who wrote The Great Gatsby, for people like James Joyce, who wrote Dubliners and Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake, artists, Picasso, Salvador Dali, Monet, all of these authors and artists were in Gertrude Stein's apartment on a weekly basis, just hanging out, talking to each other, sharing their ideas, and kind of being friends. And it really was something that had never before happened, where you'd had this many people who then went on to become great authors and artists in one space at one time. And Hemingway was right in the middle of that, was meeting all these very famous people and was kind of taking their ideas. Hemingway's life and his fiction are very much bound up, but it's very dangerous for us to say that his fiction is his life. But he definitely uses his life to shape his fiction. So he writes about the things that he knows. We cannot say that Jake Barnes is Hemingway. That is a horrible mistake, and we can never say that Jake equals. That is not something we ever will say, because we can't prove it, and frankly, it's not true. Jake Barnes is very different than Ernest Hemingway. But Hemingway does use the things in his life to create a more realistic story. We've already talked about before that he tries to write the most realistic story possible. And he does that by using the experiences that he can talk about. Jumping ahead to 1961, when Hemingway dies, he goes through a very kind of tragic end to his life. He ends up killing himself, suicide. He had moved back from Paris by that point in time, and he was actually living in Idaho. But that's when Hemingway dies. In 1961. He shoots himself in the head with a shotgun to kill himself, and so kind of a tragic end. But we're not so much interested in his death just yet, because we have so much that we can learn about his life and his time in Paris and how that influenced some of his writing when the sun also rises. So in this lecture, we talked about Hemingway's Paris and the real Paris, and how those two, Hemingway's Paris we should assume is an image of the real Paris. We talked about Spain and how it's different, but that's where all of our characters' troubles arise. And then we looked very briefly at our characters and identified what made them wounded and how they were wounded by the war, each of our three main characters. So this has been your second Flipped Classroom lecture. Please make sure to review your notes and make sure you have things that were spoken as well as written down on the screen. And we will review these tomorrow and condense them down so that they're usable going forward. Thank you.